Hey, welcome back to the Barrel Proof Baseball Podcast. Today I have new facial hair, and also I'm joined by Stephen Corrigan. Stephen is the head blender and head distiller at 1-8 Distillery out of Washington, D.C. So they're making district-made spirits. They've got all sorts of different things. And I really, really enjoyed tasting through the different bottles, different samples that Stephen and their crew sent out to me. I really like their stuff a lot. I feel like I've said this a few times, not every time, but I've said it a few times. There's a number of bottles or samples that people have sent me that I'm absolutely going to go out and buy for myself because I've tried them out, drank through them with people from the distilleries, really enjoyed them. And want to support them. I appreciate them sending me samples or bottles, and I'd like to support them. And this is definitely one of those that I will be buying for myself. 1-8 Distillery is making really good stuff. They've got a rye that I really like. They've got a bourbon. They had a gin. They had all sorts of stuff that I felt was super interesting, really tasty. I think they're on Sealbox or Drizzly or one of those. So I'm definitely going to buy it. Really enjoyed it. I really liked my conversation with Steven. This is a super bright dude. He is very well versed in just whiskey in general, and it was a lot of fun talking to him. He's super smart. Loved talking the process with him, and especially about the whiskey coming out of the Mid-Atlantic region, because this isn't an area that I think a lot of people think of immediately when we think of whiskey or bourbons. But there's a lot of rye that's coming from that region. And because of that, they're making really good stuff. So I think this is one worth checking out. I think you'll really enjoy it. The price is very good. The spirit's good. I'm in. It's a good combo. So check out this conversation with Steven. Really thought highly of this. I think you'll enjoy it a lot. I think this is one that if you listen to it, you'll probably want to get yourself some bottles of it. So check it out. If you're watching this on YouTube, check out my facial hair. I look amazing. If you're listening on Apple or one of those, you're really missing out. Let's see, what's the other thing? Oh, check out the links in the description box below and help support the channel. I've got Patreon, Amazon store, Bottomless Coffee, Walk Offs and Whiskey, Manscaped. That's it. Check those out. Click on them. Spend money. All right. Enjoy it. Stephen Corrigan, 1-8 Distillery. Bye. All right. Stephen Corrigan, distiller and head blender of 1-8 Distillery, correct? That's your role, huh?
Yep, that's what I do. That's how I fill my days. So definitely a fun way to spend one's professional life. Can't complain.
Yeah, it could be a lot worse than that.
It could be a lot worse than that for sure.
So tell me first, tell me a little bit about yourself. How'd you get into the spirits industry, and kind of take me through that transition, if you will.
Yeah, so I definitely took a very circuitous route to it, as I think a lot of people in the craft spirits world do. Definitely wasn't born into it. I'm not a third or fourth generation distiller. My old grandpappy didn't do it. So I started out of college. I was living in Chicago. We were talking a little bit about Chicago earlier. Worked in finance, got a desk job, graduated with a degree in economics. Very quickly learned that a desk job was not exactly what I wanted to be doing with my time. So I sort of started looking around for other things to do. And during my time living in Chicago, I'd gotten hooked up with a bunch of people doing community gardening, kind of urban farming and that kind of stuff, and really fell in love with just kind of that physical work of getting your hands dirty and having a tangible product at the end of the day. It was something that I really fell in love with. So I went back to school for organic agriculture and kind of did that for a number of years, kind of mostly working in sustainable fruit and vegetable production. And during that time, got really interested in alcohol, both from the I mean, I was interested in alcohol beforehand, but mostly as on the consumer side of it. But I got really interested in how people grow the ingredients for it and go through all the production steps for it. So my first foray was more into the wine world. So worked at a couple of different wineries in Europe, in Germany and Italy, and then came back to the East Coast, the US, and tried to do it up in New England, which was fun and enjoyable from a production standpoint. But in terms of the quality of the wine we were making, probably not the highest caliber to be growing grapes and making wine in Maine and New Hampshire. But while I was up in Maine, I did get an introduction to distilling from a winery that I worked at that had both wine production and spirit side to the business as well. And that's where I kind of really saw that this is the avenue that I thought a lot of producers who are interested in making really high quality alcohol from ingredients that were specifically produced in the Northeast could create products that were really unique and showed the spirit and a lot of the flavors of the area where we're living. So that's kind of how I cut my teeth on it. After doing that for a while, I got back into doing kind of fruit and vegetable production and eventually moved down to Virginia. And the cool thing about growing fruits and vegetables is that you really have your summers or your winters rather to do with whatever you want. And so one winter while I was working, I found out that these guys at 1-8 in DC were opening up a new distillery. And I kind of just showed up at the door one day and said, "Hey, I've got nothing to do. I'm here. Happy to be free labor for you. Do you mind if I come help?" And luckily they let me in the door and were happy to have the free labor. And I kind of never left. So something that I completely fell in love with, the process, the working with farmers that we do, and the end products we're putting out. So it's been really enjoyable, and we've really loved the ride.
What kind of crossover is there between like making wine in Germany? Because I've been to Germany a few times, had some wine over there, and it was pretty good.
Yeah.
Haven't done Italy yet, but I loved going over to Europe and experiencing the different cultures there. But how was that?
Yeah.
How did that kind of prepare you for like getting into grains and moving into the spirit industry?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, most of what I was doing over there was very fruit focused, but it really taught me the nuances of fermentation. So most of what we were doing fermenting over there was done with native or indigenous yeast. So you have to be really, really careful with how you're handling that stuff, and to make sure that fermentation goes complete and dry, and you're getting the alcohol that you want, and you're not getting any sort of infections or off flavors coming through. So you have to pay really, really close attention to it. The one step that it doesn't add when you look at making a beer or making a whiskey or something from grain is that you don't really have to cook it. So you're really just taking a raw product and really trying to influence it as little as possible to make that end product. Whereas a beer or a whiskey, you really do have to have a lot of hands-on influence to the raw ingredients that you're working with.
What's that transition like once you're, like you said, you're going from raw ingredients to now you're cooking it? Like how much growth or how much of the learning curve was there for you going from like wine into, like, you had your background with grains and growing, but now moving into like distilling?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a pretty steep learning curve. I definitely made a few mistakes along the way. It took us a little bit of time, and luckily we had good mentors and good teachers that we could draw on. So Alex and Sandy, or Sandy Wood and Alex Offer, are two founders, and Alex is our head distiller. Spent a little bit of time at Smooth Ambler, kind of learning the process and seeing everything that goes into it. So we had a pretty good base knowledge. And both Alex and I spent a little time at Koval in Chicago, kind of learning the ropes so that we knew a little bit of what we were doing, so that we weren't just going to flush thousands and thousands of dollars down the drain. But it definitely took not so much time and effort to figure out what we were doing. You can kind of read a recipe and figure it out, cook the grain, add enzymes, add yeast, and things like that. It's not rocket science to figure it out. What took us a little bit of more time is really kind of pinpointing that recipe and pinpointing exactly how we wanted the flavors to go, and not only from creating that raw product, but also how it's going to look and how it's going to taste after it's aged for a few years. We both had kind of minimal experience allowing things to age in barrels for an extended period of time, so you sort of have to extrapolate what that's going to look like after a couple of years. So that was definitely a little bit of a learning curve for us, but it really gave us a great opportunity to work with a lot of really interesting ingredients, and a lot of our farmers helping us out along the way. So it took us about a year before, for example, for our bourbon, which we'll taste in just a little bit here, I'm sure, actually proposed a strain of corn for us to use, or a variety of corn that he thought would work really well as a bourbon, which is our Hickory King corn, which is a large kernel white dent corn. And so, we'd already been making bourbon for about a year at this point. And as soon as that stuff came off the still, there was just this kind of creaminess and sweetness to it that we really just fell in love with. And we've used it for every drop of bourbon that we've produced since then. So go ahead.
What is that like? And you have, I mean, obviously it's a science, based like process that you're going through with making it, but I feel like with the blending side, there's got to be kind of an art to it as well. I mean, how do those two like commingle in terms of mixing the science of the distilling and then the art of blending it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we always say about all the products that we make is that we kind of make it for ourselves, and then we hope that at the end of the day, someone else is going to like it too, that there's enough people to kind of keep us in business. I feel very fortunate in that, I'm not walking in to a big brand where, I don't have to make Buffalo Trace every single day and have it taste exactly the same, or someone's going to come back and get mad at me. We produce products that have a fair amount of consistency to them, but we also produce products that we can take in whatever direction we want. So a lot of what I do on the blending side is saying, I'll get kind of an idea in my head and say like, oh, I bet that X, Y, and Z flavor will work really well together. And then I just go back and I make a test batch of it, and then, do subtle tweaking, whether it's adding in another ingredient or taking something out or changing the proportions a little bit. It's nice to have the ability to be able to do that and be kind of playful with it, and produce something that's not just kind of like the same product day after day after day.
Sure. What kind of like overall creative control do you have over those types of things? Like, do you get kind of free reign to, hey, let's mix and match, let's try this out, see how this one goes, and if it's not any good, you move on. If it's really good, like you move forward with it. And how much of that goes through you or like somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, so from the blending side, it's pretty much the buck stops with me. So I get a lot of the control over that. Now, that being said, I had a lot of creative control in sort of crafting what our bourbon and rye specifically were going to look like from day one. Now that they're kind of out there, we do need to keep them somewhat consistent, so that the amount of creativity I can put into that is somewhat minimal. But for example, for the bourbon, we had originally thought when we started the distillery that we were going to release two different bourbons. One that was a high rye bourbon and one that was a wheated bourbon. And we got to the time where we thought that those were starting to become ready, and we started to want to think about putting that out as a bottled product. And for some reason, I got the idea in my head and I couldn't let it go, that I wanted to see what they would taste like blended together. So it was through trial and error, and came up with 20-25 different attempts at coming up with a good recipe. We actually do blend those two, the high rye and the wheated, together now to create that flagship bourbon that we have out there. So it was a little bit of creativity kind of on day one. Now that's for our district made lineup. So that's kind of our core, everything made in house lineup. Now we also have something called the Untitled lineup, which I know we're going to get to one of those today. And that it's kind of like do what you want, which is really a fun way for not only me but the rest of the team as well to kind of come up with whatever we want. I know our salespeople and marketing people would probably like it if I reined that in a little bit, so it was actually a little bit easier to talk about. But we have put out versions of that Untitled series that are 6, 7 ingredients, all coming from not only different base whiskeys going into them, but also different finishing process that we do as well, to kind of create layers of flavor. And um, those ones take a long time to kind of sit down and make sure that we do it right. We've made some things that were quite honestly undrinkable, but obviously that's just for us. We haven't
Sure.
actually released anything that's undrinkable, I don't think. Um, so that's really just we get ideas in our head and see what we can do to kind of piece them together in a way that not only is a cohesive and a well-structured whiskey, but also a lot of fun and something that you're not going to get anywhere else, and something that can be really playful.
Are those smaller batches?
Typically, yeah. So it depends on the particular one that we're doing and what it's going to be. So we have ones that are very strictly distillery only releases, and those tend to be fairly small in like 150 case range, because we're selling them all in house. We do have a couple that go out for distribution as well, which need to be a little bit bigger, but those are all, I think the largest one we've done was like 500 cases or so. So they're all fairly small batch. I mean, everything we do is fairly small batch. We put out a batch of any of our flagship products, it's usually somewhere in that 400 to 500 case ballpark as well.
So tell me a little bit about just 1-8 distilling in general. Like, kind of how did it get started? Why I always feel like there's a cool story behind why they ended up getting started in the first place. So I go back a little bit to the beginning of 1-8 distilling in general.
Yeah, so let me start with our name, because that's always a question that we get fairly often. So 1-8 Distilling was named after Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which, amongst a few other things, allowed a district to be created to be the seat of the U.S. government. So it's kind of a little nod to our hometown of D.C. here. But we were started by Sandy Wood and Alex Lawfer, our two co-founders. Sandy, who's our CEO and handles a lot of our business side and paperwork side. He's a former lawyer, so it's really helpful to have a person like that do all the paperwork for you. And Alex worked in biolabs and is very much a science-focused person. So he became our head distiller, very good person to have in that role, who knows all the science very well, in a way that he can talk and go over my head very quickly as someone without a very strict science background. But they were college buddies, and both ended up in the DC area, and had liked to hang out, liked to drink whiskey together, and just got it in their minds that they wanted to craft something a little bit different than what everyone else in the country was doing. And for them, it was really important to have something that really focused on where we were and highlighting both the flavors that come out of the Mid-Atlantic region, as well as supporting the local agriculture scene here, in a way that really hadn't been done in any sort of real structured way in the area. So it was always kind of important from day one that we knew we were going to focus on whiskeys, and knew that was going to take a little bit of time to kind of get off the ground. So also wanted to focus on doing some of those clear spirits as well. So doing gin and vodka, as well as a barrel rested gin, which I think we're going to get to taste in a little bit here as well. And really just, it was important from day one that the production side of the business was always going to sort of be the driving force. So we wanted to have that ability and that what am I trying to say here? The ability and the experimentation, I guess, to be able to put out kind of a large swath of products and really kind of focused on whatever we thought was good to be able to put out there and really kind of appeal to a large audience by doing so. So we've done things like brandies, we've done some products that are hopefully going to be released down the line, working with some kind of alternative grains and things like that as well. So we've got a pretty full rick house these days of all sorts of experiments that we haven't quite rolled out to the general public yet, but hopefully something that you'll see down the line as well. So, but yeah, so 1-8, we've always kind of focused on really highlighting those ingredients of the Mid-Atlantic region and being as experimental as we possibly can.
How I mean, I looked on the website. It looks like all the grains are coming within like 500 miles of DC, right?
Yeah, most of it, I would say 90 to 95% of it is actually much closer to that, within like 50 miles or so. So we work with 2 farms in Virginia and 1 in Maryland that are both within a couple hours drive. The furthest that we get grain shipped to us from is North Carolina, and that's all of our malted products, or malted barley, malted rye, and malted wheat. Come from a malt house in Asheville, North Carolina called Riverbend Malt, which is really, really great small batch malt house that we've worked with from day one. So it's the malting, the 2 kind of barriers to local ingredients or local products that we want to use have always been the malting and the malt houses and the barrel producers. So there weren't really a lot of local malt houses that were really close to DC when we started up. There have been a couple that have opened since, and their quality is not 100% there yet. But we do continue to kind of do some experiments with some closer malt houses as well. And then the barrel side, we had been sourcing barrels from Independent Stave Company, which works both in Missouri and Kentucky, which are a little bit further afield than we'd like to go for that. But when we started up in 2014. You actually had to go on wait lists for barrels. You couldn't get them anywhere. It was so difficult to get on those wait lists. And they would only allocate us like 40 barrels a quarter or something like that. It was insane. That supply chain has changed a little bit in the subsequent years, but it was difficult. So we sort of had to take what we could get. And I don't want to say anything bad about Independent Stave Company. They make a really quality product. But about a year and a half ago, we switched to a barrel company called the Great West Virginia Barrel Company. So get all of those out of White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. We've been really happy with those guys, and they really make a quality product. And we haven't released any whiskeys out of those barrels yet because they're only a year and a half old. But the tasting that we've done out of them has shown a lot of promise. So we're really excited about that collaboration as well.
It seems like there's, from like the craft perspective, like there's a lot of different areas that keep popping up and becoming more and more popular. Like Colorado, for example. What is that? How crowded is that space from like the Mid-Atlantic region? Just in terms of, are there a lot of distilleries that are putting whiskey out there? Are you guys kind of doing your own thing separate from, what's going on out there in the region?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the Mid-Atlantic, speaking generally, has become kind of a hotbed of particularly of whiskey producers. A lot of those producers are focusing on rye whiskey because rye whiskey has such a rich agricultural heritage in the Mid-Atlantic region. Distilling's been done here since colonial times. The first distillery, or the first major distillery in our region, was George Washington's Mount Vernon, and that was really the big product that his farm and his estate was able to put out was primarily rye whiskey. Now, I've had the rye whiskey from Mount Vernon, and it's nothing like what we would consider any of the modern rye whiskeys today. It's interesting to taste as a novelty, but I can't necessarily recommend it. But it really kind of served as the this jumping off point to launch rye whiskey kind of in the consciousness of the Mid-Atlantic region. So there are some people out there who have kind of focused on rye whiskey. Some of the ones you may have heard of are like Sagamore, Catoctin Creek, or some of the whiskey producers in our area. There haven't been a whole lot that have focused on bourbon specifically. And and we do make a rye whiskey, but probably the vast majority of our production focus is on that, producing that bourbon.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, obviously Pennsylvania seems like that's a big, hotbed for rye, but I don't know. I don't know if it's just because where we're at right here in Arizona, where a lot of it doesn't necessarily get out this way and like it's on the shelves, for people to see. But I think it's becoming more interesting for people to kind of branch out a little bit and get away from the idea that it has to be from Kentucky or, Tennessee or something like that. There's such good whiskey being released from other places right now. And you don't hear, we haven't heard of many coming from like the DC area or just the Mid-Atlantic in general.
Yeah, it's funny. It's amazing. It never fails to amaze me how many people I have on going through a tour that we give in the distillery or something like that, and go, "Wait, you make a bourbon? How do you make a bourbon here? Can't bourbon only be made in Kentucky?" And Kentucky's done a really good job marketing themselves that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so bourbon you can make anywhere in the country. It does need to be made in the United States. It is a geographically protected spirit. But there are some people doing some really cool stuff all over the country. There's people out in Arizona doing some cool stuff too. I've seen some like mesquite smoked whiskeys coming out. I'm blanking on the name of the distillery right now, but
there's Thumb Butte out here. Is it Adventurous Stills, I think, is out here. But yeah, there's a couple. They're popping up everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's now I forget when this happened. I want to say it was 2018. There's now a distillery making whiskey in every state in the country. So it's there's a lot of good stuff out there, and there are a lot of people, maybe trying to rush things or do some things that are a little bit shady, but it's really a great time to be a whiskey drinker because there is so much variety out there, and really I think it's important that folks try not only what's local in their area, but try everything you can get your hands on. I mean, if you have the means to do it, the only way you're going to learn about this stuff is to go out and try everything that you can. And I know I say that from a little bit of a position of privilege here, in that I have access to stocks of whiskey that most people probably don't, and I can pretty easily call up a lot of the distilleries in the country and get my foot in the door if I needed to. But that's the way you learn about this stuff. And it's interesting. I was looking through your blog before we did this, talking about kind of like the whiskey unicorns and how it's so hard to get your hands on the Pappies and the Wellers and the stuff like that. I agree with you. You don't need to spend that kind of money to extend your palate and to figure out what's out there. There is whiskey at every price point, and by all means, I don't want to discourage anyone from tasting like the big boys in Kentucky either. They all have whiskeys that are good and have solid entry price points and things like that. It's interesting to me how often craft spirits gets lumped in with the craft beer world, and it's like, oh, they're the same, they're on this kind of trajectory of growth and things like that. And I always like to kind of rein people back in and say, craft beer filled a void. The beer that we were drinking in this country before craft beer was gross.
Garbage. Trash.
It was Budweiser. It was Busch. It was, of course they had an easy time going into it and blowing the roof off a thing because they were making something that actually had flavor to it. That's not the case with craft spirits. I mean, the guys in Kentucky were making a good product. They may not have marketed it to a premium consumer, or they may not have had all these kind of $600-700 offerings like they do today, but they were making a good product. They may have just all lumped it into a plastic handle on the bottom shelf, but they knew what they were doing, and they were making a good product. What we have craft distillers have to do is really create a product that's different and says something.
Sure.
That's one of the reasons that we've always wanted to focus on using those kind of heirloom grains and different varieties, and you know, thinking of mash bills that might be a little bit different than that kind of standard really high corn percentage, and then a little bit of malted barley or a little bit of rye thrown in. You know, we very much didn't want to stick to that traditional flavor palette of like super sweet candied bourbon, but create something with a little bit more nuance to it that kind of focused on you know, creating those sort of layers of flavor and creating something that quite honestly I think is a little bit more interesting to talk about.
When you mentioned like the beer and then the craft industry filling a void for something that's not there, and like you spent time in Germany, so I'm sure you had a beer or two while you were over there. And like I know like when I came back and I had a Bud Light for the first time, I was like, this is so bad. Like I couldn't drink it. It's just so much different. And I'm with you on like the craft distillery side, where I feel like, you know, you get the big boys and they're always with their, you know, their corn, their malted barley, and then rye or wheat or something. And then you get the craft distilleries that are adding like a fourth grain, and it adds a different flavor that I think is not always seen with what's typically on the shelf. And I'm a big fan of like, go find what you can find, but like there's a lot of other brands and especially craft distilleries out there that are really good, you know, and most people like, they're not going to know they're drinking Pappy unless somebody said, hey, here's some Pappy. And then you're excited because it's Pappy, or, you know, something that comes out of a cool, you know, cardboard container that looks neat, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I always joke with a couple of other craft distillers that we want to pool our money, buy a bottle of Pappy and submit it to one of these spirits judging contests that are everything's tasted blind, just to see how it would do.
Yeah.
You know, it's good. I don't want to say that it's not good.
Sure.
But is it worth four figures? I mean, I have a hard time paying four figures for anything, even a car.
Right.
You know, I think there's so much good stuff out there at a more accessible price point, especially for people as they're learning about it. And this is one of the things that I always fault like the wine world for, is that don't make your product priced in a way that it's intimidating for people to get into it. I think the wine world has kind of corrected that over the last decade or so. But you know, you want people to like feel welcomed to learn about a new subject or new product that they haven't tried before. But no one who's like, oh yeah, I might want to learn a little bit about whiskey is going to go out and spend hundreds of dollars on it. Like,
no,
you need to create something that's going to be accessible to a large swath of people. And I think that is something that you know, bigger distilleries have done as well. But I think that's kind of always been one of the mantras of the craft distilling industry as well, is that we need to act as an educational resource for people who may not be familiar with whether it's whiskey or gin or vodka or tequila or what have you. You know, we need to create a community that's really welcoming and able to bring people into the fold.
And not to go down into like the blame game, but do you feel like that's a distillery issue that's happening, or is that from like the independent stores that are selling it at marked up prices, or is it the consumers that are willing to pay these outrageous secondary prices just so that they can get a bottle of something that, you know, their friends say are cool and you should have?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. You know, I'm not going to fault. It's so hard to fault anyone along the way, because you see that everyone is making rational choices. Even the person who is strictly like camping out to buy these whiskeys only to flip them to make $500.
It's crazy.
Down the line. Like, if there's someone who's willing to pay it, like, I can't fault anyone for doing that. The thing that always bugs me is the trophy hunters, where it becomes almost like a piece of art. And like, I have if you are in a financial position to go out there and spend $2,000 or $3,000 on a bottle of whiskey and you enjoy that, you share it with your friends, I'm not going to do that, but I have absolutely no problem with anyone doing that. what I have more of a problem with are like the people who have the trophy cases and the you know that stuff's never going to see the light of day.
Nope.
And like I I get it. I understand the status behind it and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's a consumable product. It was
Mhm.
made to be consumed. You should consume it. We have a couple of stores in DC where it's almost like walking into a museum. Like you can find anything there that you possibly want, and it's got a huge price tag on it. And eventually, someone's going to come along and pay that price for it. And I enjoy just walking through and kind of seeing all the bottles that I'll never be able to drink, and that's great. But at the end of the day, it should be consumed and enjoyed, or people have kind of missed the point, in my opinion.
No, I totally agree. Like you walk in places and like you said, it's a museum and they've got their, like, and I think also that here's the other problem when you know how much things cost, like at retail, what's suggested retail, and you're going to spend $400 on a Buffalo Trace product that doesn't cost, a fifth of that. I mean, again, like you said, if you can afford it and you have the means to do that, then have at it. But most people that end up getting them, they sit on their shelf and they don't want to open them up because they spent a lot of money or they found it and it's a rare bottle or something like that, but like you never actually get to enjoy it. That sucks.
Well, I think what people are scared of is that I had it and now I don't have it anymore.
Now it's gone.
But that's the whole point, is for it to be gone. Like
Yeah.
I have very few bottles that hang around in my bar that just sit there. I mean,
Sure.
that's just taking up real estate to me. So now I will say we are fortunate to have a bar here in DC called Jack Rose that does a really good job. The guy who why am I spacing on the owner's name now? It'll come to me later. But he's been hunting whiskeys for decades now. Brings them into the bar and sells them all by the pour. And I think that's a really great way to, even if these things are rare and hard to find, even if they're a little bit expensive, if you want to expand your palate and expand your knowledge about what's out there in the world of whiskeys, whether it's bourbon, rye, Scotch, Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskey, it's a great place to go and just kind of get a good smattering of everything that's out there. And there are top shelf ones there and you're going to pay for them, but you're paying them on the ounce price as opposed to on the bottle.
And it's crazy. Like I remember like being in Europe and everybody's drinking gin and I'm like, God, I can't get into it. But I mean,
there's some people doing some interesting stuff with gin, especially if you spend time in Germany. Like Monkey 47 is based out of Germany, doing some really crazy stuff with different botanicals. I think, well, I was going to say, I feel like a lot of people have this sort of, it's almost like a PTSD or like a very visceral reaction to gin. And I think a lot of that stems from probably a really questionable night that you may have had in college where you drank a lot of gin that probably came out of a big plastic bottle and you woke up with like a splitting headache and what felt like a dead pine tree in your mouth. And the reason for that is that most of the gins that people are, I mean, you're probably drinking cheap gin, which is, that's problem number one. That explains the splitting headache. But I feel like the way most people get introduced to gin is through what's called a London dry style of gin, which is really, really, really heavy in the juniper content. And that's hence the like piney, Christmassy flavor going on there. And it's not for everyone, that's for sure. So one of the things that we've always tried to do with our gins is use a more muted amount of juniper and really kind of amp up some of the other botanicals that we use so that it's not just kind of that one note pine flavor coming at you, but it really has a little bit of nuance to it.
For you in distilling and blending is making gin as fun, I'll just say fun as and in depth as like the whiskey and bourbon process?
I mean, I will say, at least when we were first formulating the gin, the amount of blending we had to do to get it right was insane. we thought we'd be able to we kind of knew where we wanted it to go. We would do a couple of test batches and we'd be ready to go. It took us a solid 6 months to really get it dialed in. And I don't want to take any credit for that. It was our former assistant distiller, Max, who's now a distiller at Sagamore, who really spent the time going through. I think he must have gone through 60 different test batches of making sure that we got a product that we were happy with. And the problem is that it was so easy to use that juniper as a crutch, to oh yeah, we're going to make juniper the dominant force, and it's really, the rest is just going to be supporting players. And it just really made a kind of one note gin that we didn't really love. And it had some of those medicinal notes that not everyone's into. We wanted to create something that was really unique. And I think because you're using those kind of additional flavorings and additional botanicals, gin is really a way for you to create, it's kind of a blank canvas to do whatever you want. You really can create something unique out of it. So it was a lot of fun to do it, but it's very different from how we approach the whiskeys.
Sure.
Because a lot of the whiskeys, it's, at this point, we've gotten to the point where it's, the same recipe that we're doing day after day after day. And seeing how the aging process and the barrel interaction works with it and the different flavor components that creates over time is really astounding. You don't really know until you've seen it firsthand that how much of that flavor component from whiskeys comes out of that barrel. And the cut of the wood, the thickness of the stave, the amount of char that's in that barrel really has such a profound difference on the finished spirit. It's kind of unbelievable in a way. Okay,
so you've got the gin and you've got vodka, right? It seems like everybody kind of does the clear spirits. Is that more, I don't want to say buying time, but is that a lot of that to have something that can get out to market while whiskey's aging?
I mean, that's definitely part of it. The flip side of it is just kind of wanting to announce to people that you're there and this is what you're doing. So when we first opened up our distillery, we did a vodka and we also did a white or an unaged whiskey, which is not uncommon for distilleries to start that way. For us, we wanted to take that opportunity to just announce to the neighborhood and announce to the city that we're here and we're doing this. We could have been working for 2 or 3 years before we released one of our aged whiskeys or something like that. But
nobody knows what's going on over there.
No one knows what's going on. And we wanted to create a little bit of a buzz, and we wanted to create a little bit of if you like this, wait for what's coming.
Sure.
We're constantly going to be putting out new things and is a way for us to get a little bit of almost buy-in or credibility from other people. And we knew to do that, we really would have to create something that was unique and special, because it's not hard to make a vodka. Really, the only thing that you need for something to be called a vodka is you have to distill it to 190 proof, which is easy enough to do. But most vodka, or I think the flavor profile of most vodkas is either it tastes like nothing or it tastes like burning. And neither of those are really kind of interesting to me. So one of the things that we decided to focus on kind of from day one was making a vodka that was using rye as the primary ingredient. And, we talked about the rye's kind of importance in the Mid-Atlantic in terms of the agricultural heritage. And that was one of the reasons. But part of it was just that rye has such a strong flavor that even if you distill it up to 190 proof, it still has some flavor and it still has some characteristic that's going to come through. And that was really important to us, to have that spirit that was saying something interesting. And, to be perfectly frank, I don't drink a lot of vodka in my day-to-day life. But using the vodka that we make, I actually can make a cocktail with it that's going to taste like something.
Yeah.
So I think that was important for us, and it's definitely a product that we still we use heavily in our tasting room, and one that we can stand behind. I feel like in a lot of ways, vodka acts as kind of that gateway drug for people to get into spirits in general.
Sure.
Vodka is what they drank in college, or
Yeah.
kind of what their parents drank, or everyone knows the James Bond vodka martini, shaken not stirred. And I feel like there's a reason that I think this may have changed recently, but up until a couple years ago anyway, vodka was the number one spirit in the country, and there's a reason for that. So we felt that vodka was a good way to kind of get people in the door and be like, hey, we also make this other stuff, you should try it too.
Yeah.
And if that's a way for us to get people, not that we necessarily want to transition them off vodka, but just expanding people's overall palate to include things like gin and whiskey, I think is kind of one of the goals of what we try to do on a day-to-day basis.
All right, let's try a couple of these out. What do you what order? So we've got the Ivy City Gin, we've got the Untitled Whiskey number 3, we've got the Rye Whiskey and the Bourbon Whiskey. So what do you recommend we start with?
Do you have a glass of water
there
with you? All right, let's go ahead and start with the gin then.
Okay.
I asked about the water because it is kind of a flavorful spirit, and you are going to want to cleanse your palate a little bit before we move into the whiskeys. But
okay.
So I talked a little bit about kind of our flagship gin, which is the Ivy City Gin. It uses a combination of 10 different botanicals. Like I said, the kind of your standard London dry style of gin is very, very heavy juniper. So our flagship gin does have juniper in it. That is one of the definitions of what makes a gin. So you do need to have juniper in it. But it's not kind of that hit you over the head with a Christmas tree kind of flavor to it. It's more a little bit subtle. I usually describe it as kind of a cedar flavor as opposed to a pine flavor. But overall, it's a very soft spirit, a lot of nuance to it. When we decided we wanted to do a barrel rested version of that gin, we kept a lot of those same botanicals, but we amped them up a little bit. So this one is a little bit heavier in that juniper content, has a little bit more fennel, a little bit of licorice added to it, and then we added orange peel as an additional 11th botanical. So as you taste it, you're going to notice a little bit of that kind of subtle sweetness to it, and all of that's coming from that orange peel. So on the nose, you're going to get a lot of that kind of citrus smell to it. So that's coming not only from that orange peel being in there, but also some of our other kind of citrusy botanicals, things like lemongrass, lemon peel, and coriander are going to give you those kind of citrus notes. And you get a little bit of that influence of the wood as well. So the barrel rested Ivy City Gin is rested in both ex-bourbon barrels as well as new charred American oak. So just like our whiskeys.
This is a stupid question. When you say rested in, is there a difference in aging, or is it a time frame that
this is kind of language we have to use because the American government is a little bit silly in how they write their laws.
Gotcha.
This has changed within the last year, but up until about a year ago, you could not call a gin aged. We actually got the label for this gin rejected like 3 or 4 times because of terminology on it. So we call it barrel rested because you weren't legally allowed to call a gin barrel aged.
Interesting. How long does it rest there?
So like I said, combination of ex-bourbon and new American oak. The ex-bourbon barrels will be in there for about 6 months. The new oak will be in there for about 3 months, and then we'll dump and refill that another 3 months, and then blend all of that together.
Wow.
So
it's way more citrusy than I would think from a gin.
Yeah. And that's kind of a lot of that orange peel influence coming through. But what we were trying to do with this was kind of twofold. We wanted to create something that was for gin drinkers, something that would handle really well kind of your classic gin cocktails, especially your kind of stirred higher, more assertive ingredient cocktails, things like a Negroni, which is gin, Campari, and sweet vermouth. And we wanted something that would kind of stand up to those more assertive flavors, and really kind of be able to shine through them, which is accomplished not only from the kind of amped up only because of the amped up botanicals in here, but also the alcohol percentage as well. So you may have noticed, or you may not have noticed on the barrel, this is coming in at 102 proof. So a little bit higher octane than a lot of the gins out there that usually come in around 80 proof or so.
Doesn't taste like 102.
Yeah, and that's what makes it a little bit of a dangerous spirit.
Yeah, I believe it. I think this could probably sneak up on you a little bit.
Yeah, and that was a lot of that focus of coming up with the botanical blend, was making sure it was something that could kind of stand on its own and be something that really what that alcohol percentage does. And this is going to be true of a lot of the spirits we're going to taste today. Alcohol is not only providing you the burn and like the feeling that alcohol gives you, but it also provides a lot of the flavor as well. And one of our tenets has always been that we want to give you spirits that are as full of flavor as we possibly can. If you want to add ice or if you want to water it down home, by all means do that. You can add your own water at home. You can't make a spirit more flavorful or higher in alcohol at home. Just you don't have the technology, but you can always add your own water. So bring it down to whatever proof or whatever percentage you want. And a lot of that, especially if you're going to use these things for cocktailing, is going to be done through the stirring or the shaking process, where you're adding a little bit of dilution in as well. So this guy, the barrel rested gin, we wanted to be able to kind of handle a little bit of dilution, still have a flavor that shines through.
I think that's kind of the turnoff though of gin in general. Like you said, it's like it tastes like Christmas in a cup, and it's like there's no way you can like imagine you're going to drink it neat, because it's too much. This is you could definitely drink this neat. It's got so many different flavors to it.
Thanks. Yeah. So I mentioned a little bit, we wanted it to kind of stand up in those more assertive cocktails as well. But the other reason, and the reason that it rests in barrels, is that we also wanted to give that kind of gateway point for people who were interested in whiskeys to start exploring gin. So a lot of the flavor components that you're going to see here, they may seem a little bit foreign to you, but you're getting a little bit of those kind of vanilla notes, a little bit of that kind of barrel sweetness coming through, a little bit of that char influence. So this spirit does remarkably well in your standard traditional whiskey cocktails as well. When I make it fashioned at home, this is the spirit that I use for it now.
Really?
Especially if I'm looking for something a little bit different, or I'm looking for something in wintertime that's going to have a little bit more of that spice to it. It works really, really well in that setting as well.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I mean, as somebody, I don't drink gin, but that's really good. And it's not, and it may or may not be because of a plastic bottle in college, but definitely, definitely possible.
Like I always say, we've all been there. We've all been on a budget. We all drank whatever came our way.
Yep.
But it's we wanted to make something that really could stand on its own and be a little bit more complex, or at least enjoyable. But it's really the melding of all of those botanicals together, as well as spending that time kind of mellowing in oak, that creates that cohesive flavor profile to it. So one that really
that's awesome. That's good stuff. What do you go to next?
So next I'm going to move us on to the bourbon.
Okay.
So the district made straight bourbon whiskey. So we talked a little bit about kind of the other distilleries in our area. So both the whiskeys, the district made whiskeys that we're going to taste today, were the first bourbon and the first rye whiskey released in DC since at least Prohibition. So one that we're both whiskeys that we're super proud of, and have really kind of been trailblazing spirits. So, like I said, before, the bourbon whiskey, kind of its secret sauce is the use of that Hickory King corn. So that large white kernel dent corn, really kind of gives. You're going to notice both on the nose and on the palate as you take a sip. There's just this kind of like buttery creaminess that comes from that corn that is really enjoyable, and really is something that we fell in love as soon as this started coming off the still. You know, you could taste it in the raw white spirit, and it persists throughout the aging process into the finished product as well. So one that we're super happy with. That Hickory King corn, there is a little bit of evidence that it was one of the original corn varieties that was used when bourbon was first coming into popularity in places like Kentucky, and then sort of fell out of favor as people moved. You know, the grain market is very much a commodity market these days. So most of the corn that you're seeing go into spirits, especially in the bigger whiskey houses, has the eloquently named variety of industrial dent corn number 2. So it's, you know, the same stuff that they're making corn syrup out of, which is why that, and the combination of really high percentage of corn in the mash bill, is why you get that kind of super sweet, brown, sugary flavor coming through in most commercial bourbons. You know, we wanted to create something that was a little bit more structured, a little bit more kind of nuance to it. So the corn variety was a good way to do that. As well as just, you know, the mash bill that we're using, which is kind of unique. So we're using a comparatively small percentage of corn to most commercial distilleries. So it's about 60% of the mash bill is comprised of corn. And then, like I said, we blend those two different base bourbons together. So a high rye and a wheated bourbon as well. So in descending order, the mash bill will go corn, rye, wheat, malted rye, and then malted barley. And that malted rye is really kind of one of the signature flavors that you're going to see that persist throughout our spirits. You'll get to see it in the rye whiskey in a little bit more kind of concentrated form. But it's a really, really interesting ingredient that not a lot of, there are some distilleries working with it, but not a whole lot. And it really kind of gives this interesting, almost like crystallized honey, especially on the finish of the spirit coming through. So one we're really happy with. So
that finish lingers nicely. That sticks around. I mean, that really sticks around.
And that's something that we shoot for most of our spirits. You know, we want you to be able to kind of sip it, enjoy it, think about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, especially once it opens up in the glass, if you let that sit for 30, 45 minutes, really starts to linger on your tongue, even all the more.
It's really nice.
So I have to ask, are you a whiskey purist? Are you a only drink it neat kind of person?
You know, okay, so no, I normally do just purely because I like it that way. But I always try and throw a couple drops of water after I have it neat, just to see what it's like. And then I will try it on ice, just to see if it changes in a way that I really like it. There is one that is popular at the moment that I couldn't drink it without ice, more than one ice cube, and with a cigar. That was the only way I could enjoy it. But I normally do just drink it neat, and I, at the very least, start there and try it out, and then see if the water does add anything to it. Because I think, especially, I mean, I really like Irish whiskey as well. And so I think a lot of Irish whiskeys really open up with a little bit of water.
Yeah,
So I try to do the same, but I try to taste it both ways.
yeah. I mean, I think that's I asked because it's a question that we get a lot of, like, is there a right way to drink whiskey? And it's really a question that kind of bugs me.
Mm-hmm.
And I always feel like the right way to drink anything is however it tastes best to you.
Yep.
And the kind of mantra out there that you get from a lot of people who are really into whiskey of like, oh, you have to drink it neat, or maybe a drop or two of water is okay. Um, Really, I think kind of shuts some people out of
Yeah.
the whiskey world in general. Um, but I completely agree with you. I mean, we as we're going through the blending process and as we're coming up with new products, it's important for us to kind of hit that proof uh, right on, so that it is something that you can drink and you can enjoy right out of the bottle.
Mm-hmm.
But and that's if I'm doing blending or if I'm doing something in a professional capacity to make sure that it's a product that's good to go out the door, I'm almost always drinking it neat, or maybe a drop or two of water. But if I'm enjoying it at home, I very rarely drink spirits neat out of the bottle unless
Yeah.
I'm trying something new for the first time.
Yeah, unless it's something I'm like you said, if it's something new, or if it's something I just know that I like neat, and I'm only going to have a little glass or two,
Yeah.
then I'll have it neat, just to enjoy it in that way. But I'm with you, and it drives me nuts. Like, I remember reading Pappy Land, which I thought was a great book, but it was Julian Van Winkle's grandson ordering Pappy on the rocks with twist of lemon, and the bartender throwing a fit over it. And it's like, you're telling the grandson of the owner that he's drinking their whiskey wrong. Like, it just shows like there isn't really a way to drink it right.
Yeah.
Drink it how you like it.
No, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I really like that. I really like how that's kind of one of the bigger ones for me. Like, I don't really like whiskeys that go away quickly. I really like when it kind of lingers, especially like towards the back of your tongue or like the sides of your mouth. And that to me sticks around nicely. I dig that one for sure.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think that is another kind of byproduct of not focus, and not to say that we don't focus on the corn, because the corn is the majority of the mash bill, so it definitely is kind of the star of, or should be the star of any bourbon that you're drinking. But we like to not focus on that like super high corn percentage, super sweet whiskey, because those are the ones that tend to have that thinner body, which leads to that kind of flat finish, or at least short finish on your tongue. Layering
Definitely.
the mash bill with that rye and the wheat, and especially those malted grains coming through, is really how we make sure that we get a spirit that's going to linger with you.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that one. I can see that one doing very well for sure.
I appreciate that. Now, I know you're more of a bourbon person than a rye, but I'm going to move
Until
you on.
recently, I've gotten into the rye a little bit more recently, because it was the same, like, not that long ago, actually. It was maybe within the last 2 years. I had my first like rye. A friend of mine's from Pennsylvania brought a rye out, and it wasn't for me. There was just it was like pungent. It didn't work for me. And I think I started with something that was a little bit too heavy on the rye. And then I got like a, what is it? Rittenhouse, which was like the 51%. And so it was nice, like kind of change with a little bit of spice, not overwhelming with it. And then I started some more different ryes, and all of a sudden I'm like, man, I think I'm kind of digging these ryes right now. They're definitely interesting.
Yeah, so probably, and being that your buddy came from Pennsylvania, I can say this almost definitively. You were drinking what's called a Pennsylvania or Monongahela style rye, which, like you said, is just an overwhelming majority of rye grain going into the mash bill. So typically, Pennsylvania style ryes are somewhere between 95 and 100% rye going into the mash bill, and that is going to create a spirit that is spicy, so like really heavy on those kind of clove, allspice. Also almost like medicinal or herby. So you may have noticed flavors of like mint or dill or fennel seed or things like that coming through. So that was one of the more original styles of rye, typically referred to as that Pennsylvania or Monongahela style rye. So the other flavor of rye, which is where kind of Rittenhouse fits into a little bit better, is what's referred to as a Maryland style rye. Also, what district made rye whiskey is going to be as well. Adds a little bit of corn into the mash bill to round it out. So the mash bill in this guy is about 60% rye, 25% malted rye, and about 15% corn to round it out. And it's just going to create that spirit that's a little bit smoother, a little bit softer, a little bit easier to enjoy on its own. And why I appreciate a Pennsylvania or Monongahela style rye, I wouldn't typically drink a glass of it. Like if I was going to have a rye whiskey cocktail and I really wanted the punch of that spice to come through, that's kind of, to me, where it has more of a place, because you really want those kind of more assertive flavors of the rye grain coming through.
Yeah. I started to like the ryes, like the heavier ryes in old fashions.
Yeah.
So and because
a little bit of that sweetness to cut it.
Yeah.
Spice a little bit for sure.
Yeah. But then you kind of still have that spice that's like in the background a little bit. You know, it's kind of a nice mix versus even like using a wheated bourbon in an old fashioned just gets too like really dulled down and soft for me. And I don't get into it. But those ryes, or even just a high rye bourbon, I think is really nice for those.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, you're getting a little bit of that punch, and what you're doing there is you're adding a little bit of that supplemental sweetness, almost like corn does in a Maryland style rye, just to kind of make it a little bit more, I don't want to say palatable is the wrong word, but a little bit kind of softer and easier to enjoy. So this district made rye is, like I said, Maryland style rye. So it does have a little bit of that corn in the mash bill to kind of sweeten and smooth it out. But also that really high percentage of malted rye. This is a little bit about what I was talking about when we were in tasting the bourbon. This is the spirit where that malted rye really shines through. So that malted rye is going to give you these flavors of like that crystallized honey, which is really the flavor that lingers with you on the finish.
Ton of honey.
What's that?
It's all that tastes. That's a ton of honey.
Yeah. And also kind of flavors that are like cola flavors, or like a cherry cola coming through, especially on the mid palate, is where you're gonna get that. Almost all of that influence is coming through from that malted rye. It's a really great ingredient. I quite honestly don't know why more distillers aren't using it.
Yeah, why? I don't think I've heard really of anybody using a malted rye.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to talk badly about anyone ever, but I think that a lot of people getting into craft distilling see the easiest or the path of least resistance as kind of mimicking the mash bills of bigger whiskey players, just with, you know, local ingredients or smaller batches or what have you. And at least 9 out of 10 big distillers are using malted barley as their only malted ingredient coming through. And so it's just kind of automatic in people's mind. Malted barley is also a lot easier to find as a base ingredient. You know, we kind of fell into it just with the malt house that we were using, that they were really trying to push it as a new ingredient, not an ingredient, but an ingredient that they wanted to feature just because they were so passionate about it. So as we were developing mash bills, it became something that we decided we really wanted to try. And it's now featured in any spirit that I take that back. That's and every spirit that we've released to date that's made from grain has that malted rye in some capacity to it, just because it adds such a great flavor component that I can't really see how you put in with another ingredient.
It's like what I like about it is it kind of, for one, I don't love that mint flavor in ryes. It's not bad. Like there's a place for it, but again, say college, it almost feels like the end of the night after you've had one or two menthol cigarettes, and you're, and it's like, yeah, I know, right?
I've never had a night that bad in college.
Me neither, but I know a guy. But like, but this doesn't have that minty, like that minty almost aftertaste, not even a finish of it. It's like an aftertaste that to me is kind of off-putting. Like it has a spice and then it's like minty. This definitely, I mean, it's straight honey at the end. It's really nice.
Yeah, and like I said, a lot of that's coming through from the malted rye. The menthol never really bugged me as a flavor component. It was always more the herby flavors, which I know mint is an herb, but that like kind of dill fennel thing coming through that you'll taste in a lot of those Pennsylvania style ryes. That just really, it felt out of place. Like that savory note in a rye whiskey just kind of feels out of place to me. And so definitely kind of personally gravitate more towards those Maryland style ryes. Lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
I'm all in on the rye.
So yeah, one that we're super happy with. Honestly, I wish we were making a whole lot more of it. But I think,
right, 94?
94, yeah.
94.
And 95 was on the bourbon. I didn't mention that. I think that at least in the craft whiskey world to date now, bourbon is still king. But if I could get a lot more people excited in rye and I could make a whole lot more rye, I'd be a much happier person.
I mean, it would make me happy too.
As you can see, of the level of these bottles, there's nothing left here. If I'm pouring just a glass of whiskey for myself at the end of the day, that's what I grab.
Yeah, I can see that.
7 out of 10 times.
Yeah.
And I know, talking to other distillers, that I am not alone in that. I have talked to several big bourbon producers who have said, if we could make rye all day, we'd be the happiest people in the world. Is
there a cost issue that makes it a little bit more preventative, or is it just it's a preference?
It's kind of it's three things. So it's preference, mostly what the market is saying. And I think when people get introduced to whiskeys, or at least to American whiskeys, they always get introduced to bourbon first. Whether that's right or wrong, it's just kind of usually what happens. And I would imagine probably when you got into whiskey, it was probably the same thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Introduced to bourbon first. Cost is not insignificant, so it is more expensive for us to make a rye whiskey than a bourbon, in terms of kind of a proof gallon or an alcohol creation. Part of that is a little bit of us shooting ourselves in the foot, though, because we use such a high percentage of that malted rye. Malted grains in general are just much more expensive, and malted rye even more so than malted barley. The cost of our malted rye is probably, I'd have to look at our most recent invoices to make sure I get this right, but about 5 times the cost of unmalted rye.
Wow.
So there is definitely a cost to using that. We 100% think it's worth it, and that's why we continue to do it, because we like it so much. And then the third is that, can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Rye is a real pain in the ass ingredient to work with. It is
interesting,
really sticky, really gummy. We used to, this is going to get a little bit into the production side, so feel free to edit it out.
No, it's interesting. I'm in.
Our original mashing process, we used what's called a tube and shell heat exchanger, which is essentially like a large canister with little pipes that go through it. And the mash goes through those little pipes, and the rest of the canister is filled with cold water. And that's how we cool the whole thing down. When we're done cooking, we want to cool it to add the yeast. Almost every time we made rye whiskey, that thing would plug itself up, and it would take like an hour and a half to 2 hours to get it unplugged. We've since switched the kind of heat exchanger that we're using to make that a hell of a lot easier for ourselves. But I can see why there are people out there who refuse to make
against it. Yeah.
pain in the butt to deal with.
But does that, like making a rye, like a straight rye or a higher percentage rye, is that does do the same problems exist with like a high rye bourbon, that or even something with a higher percentage bourbon where you're not over like that 51% necessarily, where you're like an actual rye?
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have some of those production problems once you've included, a couple of grains of rye. They start to compound pretty quickly. You don't necessarily, it doesn't reach a critical mass until you get, I'd say, at least above 50% in the mash bill,
Okay.
where you have to worry about equipment clogging or things like that. Things will move a little bit more slowly, and they might be a little bit sticky. You might have to do a little bit of extra cleaning to make the process all run smoothly. Rye grain also tends to foam pretty heavily in distillation. So you can have situations where fermenters will actually overflow with the amount of foam that a high rye percentage mash bill will produce. So we use a little bit of an anti-foaming agent, which is essentially just like a fat. So adding a little bit of fat to the fermentation process will actually not allow the bubbles in the foam to form properly. So they'll just pop much more easily. You don't have to worry about things foaming out and over.
Yeah, that's that's a good rye. Like they like you said, I'm surprised more malted rye is not used, because that's such an interesting flavor. But again, like you said, it's a pain in the ass to use it, and so
yeah,
it makes it a little bit easier.
Most people you don't see more people using it is that it's they're not educated enough to know to seek it out, or
Sure.
B, they just have a hard time finding it. There's only I haven't done enough research to say this definitively, but not every malt house out there is making it available as a product. Most malt houses that you come into contact with focus on the brewing industry first, and the distilling industry kind of gets the scraps. So if you find a malt house who's willing to work with you to get you the product specifically for distilling, that is a malt house you want to keep working with. And that's in Riverbend, we definitely found those guys who are, the bread and butter of their business is still working with brewers. They're willing to work with us for pretty much any grain that we want. And I would venture a guess that we're probably buying more malted rye from them than anyone else. I don't know that for sure, but I would venture a guess.
Seems fair to say. I haven't talked to anybody that says they're using malted rye. I mean, I've heard of people using different strains of wheat or different strains of rye or whatever, but I haven't heard of malted rye being used by anybody that I've talked to.
Starting to see it pop up a little bit more kind of here and there. I know, for example, like Copper Steve's, which is a distillery in upstate New York, makes 100% malted rye whiskey as one of their core offerings. So that's a really interesting one to try if you can ever get your hands on it. You are seeing a few more people start to play around with it. Malted grains in general in distilling, I think, have fallen a little bit out of favor, because the reason malted grain was originally included in mash bills was so that you would have enough enzyme activity to convert the starches that are in raw grains into something that was more simple sugar, more fermentable, more digestible by yeast. So it really was only kind of a fluke that malted grain ever became used in distilling or anything like that. You just needed that activity to make something like corn or unmalted rye be able to break down and make it fermentable. Now a lot of that is done through added enzymes during the mashing and the fermentation process. So really the only reason that malted grains are added into mash bills is for their flavor. And we just love the way this malted rye tastes. So that's why you're seeing it throughout most of the products that we make.
Yeah, I get it. I'm in on that one. Okay, so the untitled whiskey. So I know on the card that was sent, You've got a couple of different ones on here. Are the untitled ones always available, or are these kind of a, like you were talking, we talked about them a little bit earlier, but are these more of like the rye and the bourbon and the gin, or those are more like always offered, and then these are more special issued, I guess we call it?
Excuse me. Yeah. So anything that's in that district made line is going to be our core lineup, more or less always available. You come to see us, you talk to any of the bars in town or anything like that, you'll always be able to find this. The Untitled's are a little bit more of that kind of small batch, limited release thing where they might be here one day and they might be gone the next. So like we talked about before, that Untitled series is really a way for us to be as playful and kind of experimental as possible. The vast majority of the base whiskeys that we have go into those Untitled whiskeys are whiskeys that we've sourced. So they're whiskeys that were originally distilled in another distillery, and we want to be completely upfront with that as much as we can. But we never wanted to get into a position where we're just kind of taking that whiskey out of the barrel, slapping our own label on it and sending it out the door. So we developed a cask finishing program. So basically taking that whiskey out of its original barrel, putting it in a barrel that had previously held something else. And, you know, we've played around with different kinds of blending techniques and ways to kind of layer flavor using those different finishes in a way that I think is really interesting and really allows us to create different flavor profiles that you don't necessarily typically see, at least in American whiskey. You know, you'll see some of them in Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey or places like that. But I think we've kind of really kind of tried to lead the charge of these different types of finishing processes that you can do on these whiskeys. So most of them, we will create a batch, and that is the only time that batch will ever be released. Quite frankly, enough of them are so complicated that they'd be very difficult to make again, even if I wanted to make them again.
Yeah, I was just reading up on this batch, this number 3. I can't imagine this is something you could do all the time.
Yeah, so Untitled 3 is a little bit interesting in that it is the one that we've repeated the most times.
Really?
So I think we're up to batch 6 of it now. So one we did in collaboration with a local coffee roaster, and we like to do as many of these as collaborations as we can, because then both we and the company that we're working with both get a product out of it.
Sure, yeah.
Which is always really interesting. So we did it with a local coffee roaster, gave them bourbon barrels. They roasted coffee beans in them, let them sit in there for, I think, about 8 weeks in this case. Took it out and made a bourbon finished nitro cold brew coffee out of it, which was delicious.
Yeah, I'm in on that too.
Yeah. Unfortunately, very, very limited release on that.
I bet.
They don't keep it around that often. But then gave those bourbon barrel or those coffee barrels back to us. We put wheated bourbon back in them and let it sit for about 6 months. And it just really transforms the overall flavor profile of that whiskey. So we decided to use a wheated bourbon because we wanted something that was a little bit of a kind of sweeter, softer base. So those kind of sweeter bready notes really work well paired with kind of the kind of earthy acidic notes of the coffee coming through. So
yeah, I can't see a rye being used with this.
Yeah, you know, funny you should say that. We were just thinking about trying this with a rye whiskey as well.
Really?
So I'll let you know.
Yeah, let me know how that goes, because I can see what you're saying, like the wheated, how it kind of softens it up a little bit. And so if you get something that's like the coffee gets overwhelming, I think you have the coffee with the rye. It's either going to be interesting or like not.
It's two very assertive flavors that could potentially butt heads
or be awesome.
Yeah, and that's why we try things.
The nose on this is so good. Yeah, you don't have to share with anybody.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the beauty of this business is that all of my mistakes are my own.
Yeah.
And that no one else has to ever find out about them. So yeah, the nose on this guy, you're getting a lot of those kind of roasty notes from the coffee. Not necessarily something that I would identify as coffee right off the bat. You know, if I were to blind taste you on this, I think you would have a hard time kind of pinpointing that coffee flavor, or at least
Yeah,
on the nose.
the nose. I agree. It doesn't. There's not like a coffee. Like it smells like you said roasted, but I don't get coffee on it.
Yeah, it's funny. I was pouring this out for so when we do tours of the distillery, we always have a tasting at the end, and I've poured this out for all sorts of people. But it wasn't until I was getting kind of feedback from some of the people I was tasting out one time that a guy said to me, "All I get on the nose is jalapeno," and I was like, I went back to it. I was like,
Not getting that.
"Yeah, really, you don't get it?" It's
No.
like, damn, if he's not right. I get a little bit of that kind of vegetal flavor, or not flavor, but nose coming through in the aroma. There's definitely a little bit of maybe not jalapeno, but definitely something vegetal going on there a little bit.
Yeah. I think when I think jalapeno, I think that spice. I don't get like a spice
You're
from
not
it.
getting the spice, but
Vegetal might be more
bell pepper or
bell
something
pepper.
like
Yeah, I could go green bell pepper.
yeah, maybe that's a better way to describe it. But
I don't get like a spice like from a jalapeno.
yeah, you're definitely not getting any of the that spiciness coming through. And then when you taste it, you're definitely gonna hopefully recognize the coffee a little bit more, especially on that finish. Once you take that breath in after you swallow, that's where you kind of notice the coffee influence coming through.
Mm-hmm. I think right away it's like still that kind of bell pepper vegetal like aroma or like the very front of that flavor, but then you definitely get coffee.
Yeah. Yeah, like after I've taken a sip of this, if it lingers with you. This is going to be a flavor that's going to stick in your mouth probably 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But if I were to have severe amnesia or something like that, and thinking in 2 or 3 minutes time, I wouldn't be able to tell if I just had a sip of whiskey or if I just had a sip of coffee. So definitely a lot of that coffee influence coming through.
Yeah, you're not getting strong whiskey notes for sure.
One that I think works really well is kind of an after dinner sipper. You kind of please both of your crowds, both the people who want whiskey after dinner and the people who want coffee after dinner. So it's a good way to kind of bridge that gap. Also works really well in your kind of more spirit focused whiskey cocktails as well. So my kind of go-to cocktail with this guy is to do a maple old fashioned. So use maple as the sweetening base on it. Put a couple of dashes of black walnut bitters into it, so you get a little bit of that kind of nutty, earthy flavor to it, and then a healthy pour of the whiskey on top of it. Works really, really well.
I could see that one being dangerous as well.
Yeah, super easy sipper.
Yeah. Man, that is so interesting.
So yeah, we use that Untitled series. This is really where we get to have more fun, or at least, be a lot more experimental. I probably, if not every week, at least every other week, go back and play with some of our finishing stocks and just try to come up with something new.
Sure.
I'll get an idea, or it sounds cliche, but I can't tell you how many of these have come to me in dreams, where you just get like, hey, I think these would work well together, and you just go and
try it out
with beakers and syringes and stuff like that, make up a little batch of it, and 2/3 of the time I'm way off and it's not good, and I have to start from square one. But about 1/3 of the time we get something that's pretty good, and about 10% of the time we get something that's phenomenal. And I like to think that only the phenomenal ones make it out the door.
Yeah, that's kind of the goal, I would imagine. Yeah. Is there anything out of personal curiosity? Like, I know the number 9 batch 7 mentioned like it's a fruit forward Speyside Scotch type. Is there anything that you have that is peated or along those lines with like that smoky, Isla type flavoring?
Yeah, not really. I mean, this is probably the closest one to giving you any sort of smoke.
Smoke.
We've done two that have been kind of more in that Speyside vein. The number 4, which was originally kind of the companion to number 3. So we did it with unroasted coffee beans. It's one that, talk about limited batch, we'll never do it again. Definitely one we're never going to do again because, and someone should have thought of this, and we're not idiots, I swear. But the coffee roaster took the unroasted coffee beans out of the barrel. They were soaked in high proof whiskey, put them in their roaster, immediately started a fire. So they did not get a usable product out of that. We really liked the whiskey that came out of it, but they made it very, very clear that they were not going to do that one again. They just bought the green beans from them. So probably not one you'll see again. A similar one we did, our Untitled Whiskey number 12, was done with a local chocolate maker. And they put cocoa nibs in the barrel, took them out, made both a bourbon and a rye finished chocolate bar. And then we put whiskey back in those barrels. And picked up a lot of these kind of fruity floral notes, very delicate. Again, you'd be kind of hard pressed to say that it was necessarily chocolate. At least on the nose, you get a little bit more of it on the finish of the whiskey. But very, very delicate, something that I wasn't necessarily expecting from that finishing process.
That's got to be so much fun. I mean, just throwing out ideas, going, "Hey, let's give this a try. Let's see how this goes." I mean,
it's not only fun just internally in terms of like coming up with the ideas, but to be able to work with people outside of the building and other businesses and other, especially local makers, to try to collaborate on things where we can both benefit from it is really kind of what gets me jazzed about these projects.
All right, I don't want to take up your entire night. You've given me a lot of time, and I appreciate it. But tell me a little bit, for one, about like distribution, and also can it be ordered online?
Yeah, good question. So distribution, we are distributed currently in DC, Maryland, Delaware, Illinois, Colorado, and Missouri. So fairly limited distribution footprint. All of our stuff can be ordered online, not through us, but through a couple of our retailers. One of them is a local DC liquor store called Schneider's, which you can find them online at cellar.com. That's cellar like wine cellar, CELLAR.com. They can ship to most states. I think there's a couple where the laws make it a little bit difficult, but for the vast majority of states, they can ship. And then those of your listeners who are local in the kind of DC, Maryland, Virginia area, we do have a tasting room that's open. We're open for retail from Wednesday through Sunday, and our tasting room currently is just open Saturdays for people to come in and try flights of spirits and things like that. Currently, we're not giving tours, but we're hoping to start those up again pretty soon.
And what about social media? Where are you guys out on social media? And what's a good way for people to follow you guys along?
Social media, we're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at 18D, all spelled out.
Awesome. I really appreciate your time. This was awesome. I definitely need to find that bottle of that rye because that was outstanding. That was my favorite one.
Awesome.
That was outstanding. So
we can find a way to make that happen for you.
Yeah, gotta get some links out as soon as I post this. But thanks so much, Steve. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah,
this was really cool. Thank you so much.
And good luck to your team this year.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you wearing a White Sox hat, not a Cubs hat.
Anytime. Always happy to play that.
All right. Take care.
All right. See you later. Bye.
Take care.